Sometimes reading the Bible can be a little bit tricky because it was written thousands of years ago in a very different culture. And so some of the language that the writers of the Bible use, some of the words that they use, some of the ideas that they use to try to convey the good news of Jesus, over 2,000 years, those ideas can take on, and those words can take on very different meanings. Which means that when we read more literal interpretations of the original text, the language that they use can be misunderstood and we can miss out on the good news that they're trying to teach us. And so one of the things that I do as a pastor is to try to understand as much as I can what the context was, what the culture was that the New Testament writers in particular were speaking into, so we can gain an understanding of what they're trying to tell us and how the message of Jesus is good news for us. It's something that we can all do as God's people. All Christians can learn more about what it was like at the time and place when the Bible was written, so that when we read the Bible for ourselves, we can understand more what the writers of the books and the letters are trying to tell us, and we can find the good news in their words. For example, the New Testament reading for the Sunday after Christmas, for this Sunday, is from Galatians chapter 4. And there's language which Paul uses here, which to our postmodern ears can sound actually a bit of an obstacle to the good news. But Paul uses these words and he uses these concepts and ideas in order to try to help us understand why the message of Jesus is good news for us and the gifts and the blessings that it brings. So I'm going to read for you Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 to 7. And I'm going to read it from the New International Version, which is a more literal interpretation of the Greek text. And then we're going to identify some of the words and some of the ideas, and we're going to look at them more in their historical context, their original setting, so we can understand more what Paul is trying to say to us. So from Galatians chapter 4, verse 4. When the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, so that we might receive adoption to sonship. Because you are his sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but God's child. And since you are his child, God has made you also an heir. Just in reading that already, there are a couple of words in there which can kind of get in the way of really understanding what Paul is talking about. He talks about slaves, and in our context, we know how bad slave can be when we treat people as possessions and we abuse them by demanding work for no money. We can also hear the word when he talks about receiving sonship and being adopted as sons of God. And that can sound to us as being very gender exclusive. We can start wondering, well, what about the women? What about daughters of God? Which is why some translations, instead of talking about sons of God, talk about children of God. And there are a couple of other things which make it hard to understand exactly what Paul is saying. So in order to help us maybe think about and reflect on the good news that Paul has for us in this reading from Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 to 7, I brought along some friends to help us understand particularly these ideas of slavery in the ancient context and also what it meant to be a son. Now imagine that somebody had gone out and borrowed a whole lot of money for something. Maybe they were putting down a deposit on a house, or maybe they were buying seed for their land, or they'd borrowed some money to try to do something with that cash. What would happen if that person wasn't able to repay that money is that they would sell themselves to slavery. So for example, if this is our little man who has got himself massively into debt and is not able to pay the money that he owes, what he would do is he would go along to a farmer or a wealthy landowner and he would sell his services as a slave in order to repay that debt. And so the landowner or the person who owned the farm would take him into his service, and instead of paying him the money which he would earn by working as a farmer, would actually go to paying off his debt. And so that was one way in which ancient people could pay off debts that they had. Instead of going to the bank and borrowing money at ridiculous amounts of interest, or sometimes very little interest at all, Funny days these, but anyway. Instead of going to a bank, they would go and they would sell their services as a slave. And they would work and they would work and they would do whatever the farmer asked. They would take care of the pigs and the cattle and the sheep and other things that were there. They would work and work and work until they were able to pay off their debt. Now, what would happen was that when this person who was basically treated as a slave because they were essentially working for no earnings, when this servant, this slave, had finally paid off the debt, then they were able to go free. But imagine having a debt that you couldn't pay off, that you would spend your whole life trying to repay. That's where Paul starts talking about how when the right time had come, God sent his son. And so here we have God's son, who at just the right time, biblical idea, at just the right time, he is born into the life of this farmer or this slave who was trying to repay the debts. And what Paul is saying is that at the birth of Jesus, God, who is really the owner and we could think of him as the farmer of all this, the king of all the land, the king actually is born into poverty, into this person's life. And he takes on humanity, he takes on our debts, he takes on in himself those things that we owe. And so the son of the king would come in here, and what Paul is saying is that he was placing himself under the law to redeem those under the law. Now, two ideas I want to talk about here. First of all, what it means to be under the law. We can understand that in a stricter sense, that God has commands and demands that he expects of us. We can think about the 10 commandments. We can think about Jesus' one command with two sides, to love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love one another as we love ourselves. However we want to understand God's law, what Paul is saying is that the son of the king, Jesus, is born under the law, so he kind of gets alongside and he takes the place of the slave with all these demands and expectations and pressures on him. So that's a narrower understanding of the law. A broader understanding of the law is just thinking about all the demands and pressures and expectations that we carry on our whole lives. Sometimes life can seem overwhelming with the amount of things that we feel like we have to do for other people, or the amount of work that other people expect of us, or all the demands and pressures. One of the ways we can understand the incarnation of Jesus, in other words, God's entry into the world as a human being, is that he actually joins us like the son of the king with the slave or with the worker. God actually joins us under those expectations and under those demands and under those pressures. So Jesus in his life knows what it's like to live in this world with all of the things that are placed on us. The amazing thing about Jesus, though, is that he completely fulfills the demands and the commands and the expectations of our Heavenly Father. He obeys the 10 Commandments perfectly. He loves God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. He loves his neighbor as he loves himself. And so Jesus does for us what we're not able to do ourselves, and that is perfectly fulfill God's demands and commands. He fulfills the law on our behalf. In this kind of a scenario, then what we're talking about is that the son of the king comes along and basically does the slave's work for him. The son of the king becomes part of the slave's life and does all the work that the landowner expects of the slave. Now, he doesn't just fulfill all the tasks and do everything that's expected of him. The thing that the son of the king does then is he redeems the slave. Now, in the ancient world, to redeem someone basically meant to buy them back. And so if you were wealthy enough and if you were so inclined, you could go along to the person who had the debt, or the person who was owed the money, and you could pay that debt on behalf of the slave, and that would set the slave free. And so here we have again the son of the king who goes along to the worker, to the slave, and he redeems him by actually paying off his debt. If we think about that debt in terms of sin, the way that Jesus, the son of the king, pays our debt is by going to the cross. So not only does he do what's expected of us by obeying God's law perfectly, he then goes and pays our debt for us as well by going to the cross and giving his life in exchange for ours. So through Jesus' perfect life, he does everything that's expected. Through his innocent death on the cross, he takes our place. So sin claims, or death claims him rather than having a claim on us. And so what that does, that act of redemption, that act of redeeming love, Jesus dying on the cross, is that the slave is no longer a slave. The slave is set free and can walk away from the expectations, walk away from the demands, and live now not as a slave, but as a free person, because the Son of the King took his place. But Paul goes on and then talks about how once they've been free, he redeemed those under the law so that they might receive adoption to sonship. Again, it's a gender exclusive term, but it's not excluding women. Just previously in Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, Paul has already said that there is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, nor is there male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And so when Paul talks here in Galatians 4 about being adopted to sonship, he's not talking about a gender-specific role. He's talking about a legal term. You see, in that culture, sons were the ones who received the inheritance. They were the ones who received everything that the father had when the father died. The women, they were married. I'm not saying that's right, I'm not saying that's good. It was just a different culture. Thankfully, in these days, we are a lot more egalitarian in the way we treat men and women. But when Paul talks about that they receive sonship, they're talking about a legal term, that they receive full legal rights as those who inherit everything that the father or the landowner has. And Paul says the same thing then in verse chapter 7. He says that since you are his child, God has also made you an heir. And so because of Jesus' death, we receive everything that belongs to the Father. Because of Jesus' death for us and because of the freedom that we now have as God's children, we receive everything that comes from the Father. We receive his goodness, his purity, his righteousness, his holiness. Every good thing that the Father has is given to his children because they have this legal status in his kingdom and in his eyes. And so they receive all this goodness as an inheritance because of Jesus' death. And so we're talking about slaves as people who work in order to pay off a debt. We're talking about the redeeming work of the Son who is born as a human, who fulfills everything for us, and who then pays his own life to redeem us, to buy us back, and to bring us back into freedom. And then once we are free, the King actually adopts us as his legal heirs, so that we receive all the goodness of God through faith in Jesus. And so all of this text, it's all good news. It's about freedom. It's about status in God's kingdom. It's about identity. It's about value. It's about all these things that our hearts and souls crave. And it's good news for us because there are times when we can feel like slaves, when there are so many expectations on us and so many demands and so many people wanting so much from us in so many different ways. We can feel like we're giving and we're doing and we're just kind of running on the rat wheel, just trying to get by, and we're not receiving anything in return. There are times in life when we can feel like this guy did when he was trying to work off his debt by working hard and not getting anything back. It's at times like those when this text isn't just talking about sin and freedom from sin, it's actually talking about the way we live our lives. Because we don't have to live as slaves. We don't have to spend our life trying to fulfill other people's expectations or society's expectations or even our own expectations on ourselves. We don't have to spend our lives doing all this stuff that we think that people say we should do. Instead, we can live every day in the freedom that we have through Christ. Because he has done everything that we need to do for us. He has given his life to redeem us from this slavery. And so we can live as free people in the faith that our identity is not locked up in the demands and expectations of other people, but who we are. Our core identity is that we are children of God whom he loves and with whom he is pleased for Christ's sake, and that we are heirs of his goodness and his love and his righteousness and his purity and his glory. Everything that is the Father's belongs to us. And when we find our sense of identity in that, as God's children, as his heirs, then the other expectations and demands, they don't see that important. Yes, there will always be things that we feel like we have to do or things that we have to do, and that's just part of life in this world. But they don't determine who we are or what we're worth. If we can live up to them, maybe we're doing that to bless other people. If we can't, it doesn't matter, because who we are and what we're worth is wrapped up in the Son of the King and our identity as children of God. That's who we are, that's what we're worth, and that's what really matters. So at the moment, with whatever's going on in your life, if you're feeling a bit like a slave, you don't have to anymore. You can do what you can, not because you have to or because you're obligated to, but through faith, that because of what the Son of the King has done for you, because of his birth and life and death and resurrection, you are a child of God. And so go into it with that faith, but do it then out of a sense of love, knowing that God is working in people's lives through you. He's doing good through you. Don't be a slave to other people's demands or expectations. Be who you are, because who you are is a child of God. And you can go to him and you can talk to him as your loving heavenly dad. You can live free from these demands and expectations, knowing that you are a child of God. You're worth more to him than you could ever imagine. And that faith, that brings real freedom. God keep you in the freedom you have as his child whom he loves, for Christ's sake.